today's webinar, the Australian Air Cargo Update, presented by Sarah Hales from Avistra. Please correct me, Sarah, if my pronunciation is incorrect. So my name is Scott Martin. I am the Director of Policy and Research at the Australian Airports Association, and it's great to have all of you along today for the webinar, which will cover the role of air cargo in the aviation industry and how the relationship between passenger and cargo revenues has potentially changed, possibly forever. We'll also look at some of the winners and losers for air cargo in Australia during 2020, make some observations around emerging trends, and outline some of the issues to be considered when developing an air cargo strategy and business cases. So before we begin, a couple of short reminders and housekeeping things. This session is being recorded and we will send you a copy of the recording post the webinar. It will also be available to view on the AAA website. And please, please, please submit your questions. If you have questions, please ask them. There are no silly questions and we have allowed plenty of time for Sarah to do questions and answers today, so don't be shy. If you've got questions, submit them through the panel that you're looking at when you're logged in on GoToWebinar, and we'll ask those questions for you at the end of the session. Also, we want to hear from you. Please submit your feedback on today's webinar and or any other webinar topics that you would like to see in our 2021 webinar series. But now I'm also pleased to introduce today's presenter, Sarah Hales, who's the Director of Avistra. Sarah has 15 years experience in infrastructure, logistics and aviation. She's probably best known in the industry for her key role in the construction and early operational phases of the Toowoomba Wellcamp Airport. Sarah has a solid track record in commercial innovation and excellence, aeronautical and non-aeronautical business growth and diversification. Sarah's expertise in engaging with senior decision makers and stakeholders across airlines and network teams, tourism and economic advisory bodies, local, state and federal governments has been key to her success in driving real results for business. After her great work with Toowoomba Wellcamp, she struck out on her own as the Director of Avistra. And now it's time to please welcome Sarah to our webinar. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Scott. When you write one of those bios, you don't really imagine the pain of sitting there listening to it while someone reads it out in front of a bunch of other people, do you? So Avistra is a joint venture between my company and Aviation Projects, and it specialises in providing commercial advice to airports. And nearly all of the work we're doing at the moment is in the air cargo sector because it's really important for the industry. I'm going to take you through some information. I'll just show you my screen. Here you go. Now I want to get rid of that one. Okay. So air cargo, winners, losers, and tactics. We'll get straight into it so we've got plenty of question time at the end, like Scott said. So globally, this first bit of data comes from IATA's AGM on the 24th of November and just sort of sets the scene for what's happening in air cargo at the moment at a global level. Because of COVID, capacity for air cargo fell by about 45%. However, demand only fell by about 11%. And that was because while certainly manufacturing slowed down, consumer spending slowed down as a result of COVID, there was still also a strong need for the air cargo sector to move medical goods and things like that around the world. So capacity fell significantly, demand fell somewhat, and that led to an increase in yield and an increase in utilisation of the available air cargo space. So yields went up by 30%. As a percentage of airline revenue, cargo has become more important and probably will be for quite some time. Generally, improved business confidence and the role that air cargo will play in vaccine distribution all around the world means that air cargo is expected to perform in 2021. And a slow recovery of the passenger business and a higher proportion of higher yield cargoes like that vaccine are expected to contribute to a further 5% increase in yields, which is a challenge for some of Australia's exporters that use air cargo because, as you'll see later, our greatest volume customers are actually fairly low yield and need a fairly cheap air cargo rate in order to be competitive in their destination market. So passenger volumes not really expected to recover globally until around about 2024, and domestic volumes will increase first, of course, and we're seeing that in Australia now. The relationship between passenger-related revenues and cargo-related revenues has potentially changed forever, although probably won't remain quite this extreme beyond 2024. But in 2019, cargo represented around about 12% of global airline revenues. In November 2020, IATA projected that when all of the numbers come in for the 2020 calendar year, cargo will represent 36% of total airline revenues, and in 2021 that's expected to be 30%. So a significant part of the sector, and probably one of the few parts of the sector that's actually making some money. Not that it can possibly replace what we're losing out of the passenger business at the moment, but just that it actually does provide some sort of cash flow. So passenger volumes still around 10% of pre-COVID levels, and of course that has big implications for capacity, because in Australia about 80% of our cargoes have traditionally flown underneath the freighter aircraft, in the belly hold of a passenger aircraft rather. Globally, it's more like 50-50, but in Australia, we're very dependent upon the passenger aircrafts for our cargo capacity. Interested to take a little bit of a look at what's happening in some more detail, though, in more recent times, because while we have up until now seen a reasonably even number of people coming in and out of Australia, albeit with some lag because of the orientation of the travel demand, at the moment we're seeing that outbound travel is sometimes nearly double what inbound travel is, and that's related to the caps that the Australian government has on incoming arrivals. We have around about 200,000 Australians stuck overseas at the moment, many of them desperate to come home, and there doesn't seem to be any holistic way that this is being managed at a government level. Our airline customers are having to manage this themselves, and their customer service staff are dealing with phone calls from distressed people who just want to come home. So we do need to find ways of dealing with this better. The same restrictions don't apply to people leaving Australia. People who want to go home to other parts of the world, for example, don't have restrictions placed on them by the Australian government. So that's just what's happening on the passenger side, which has implications for cargo because of the capacity drivers. So cargo's in and out of Australia. I just want to move this little thing so I can see everything and move it over there. Okay, so passengers in and out of the cargo, we're seeing in and out of Australia cargoes. We're seeing the opposite divergence at the moment. We're seeing a greater amount of inbound cargoes than outbound cargoes. And inbound cargoes have actually just about recovered to pre-COVID levels. And you can see that it's about equal with sort of the January 2019 number, or even like an April or June 2019 number. So inbound cargoes into Australia are doing quite well. Outbound cargoes, however, are still struggling a little bit and still stuck around about a 2015 level. And so we're still going to see quite a bit of recovery happen in that outbound sector. And this is possibly also related to the increasing cost of air cargo and the relative value of our outbound products as opposed to our inbound products. Total flights and total available seats in and out of Australia, so our capacity, we can see we've had the massive drop off because of COVID, and we're experiencing a slow increase in flights. At November 2020, about 3,739 flights inbound and outbound, and a seat factor of 16.9%. Inbound utilisation, again, is much less than outbound utilisation. And various global airlines are recommencing their operations back into Australia, and that is having implications for the cargoes we're seeing go to different parts of the world as capacity comes online. I shared this last time, average number of passengers and the average amount of cargoes per flight, and I was interested to see if this has changed, and it really hasn't changed since I last spoke to you in August. Cargoes went from about 5,000 kilos a flight on average to about 20,000 kilos a flight, and passengers went from about 220 average number of passengers per flight to 20 average passengers per flight. Now, of course, this reflects not only massive reduction in the number of passengers, but also an increase in the number of flights that are operating as freighter-only flights in and out of Australia, albeit some of them being actual passenger aircraft. So what's happening from a major market point of view? This data is all from Vitra, and it looks at a city pair basis. So this data does not contemplate whether the cargo is travelling to Singapore, for example, or Hong Kong, are travelling beyond there. It merely reflects how much cargo is travelled from Australia to Singapore. And some of that will have used the hub to go elsewhere around the world. So we're really only just looking at that first sector in this set of data. And we can see the impact of COVID on each market. The bright blue line that's second from the top here, you can see the massive dip occurring to that market. That's China, the first one hit, and then a bunch of other markets such as New Zealand and the UAE, and then down here as well, some of these other smaller markets all hit at the same time and seeing a reduction in their cargo volumes because of COVID. And then, of course, Singapore hit around the same time or just slightly afterwards. You can see China's two-stage recovery occurring inside the bright blue line that's sort of second from the top throughout most of the graph. And what I think is really interesting here is that prior to, in the period in 2019, prior to when COVID happened, there wasn't a lot of juggling between which airline or which destination had the most cargoes. However, now, because of COVID, we're seeing a lot of juggling in that space, and we're seeing some hubs and their airlines position themselves to take on greater market share, and they're doing that really effectively. So definitely going to see some real winners and some real losers, I suppose, out of this whole situation. At the moment, some of the ones to really keep an eye on that I think are very interesting in the way they're operating their business are Qatar Airways. So pretty much all of the cargo going to Qatar is on Qatar Airways at the moment. And you can see they've come from a fairly low base back here, and they're climbing back up, and they're like halfway to the top now in terms of actual volumes, which is pretty remarkable. Another one that's doing really well at the moment is Taiwan. Same thing, came from this low base and has grown their volumes. And the US, so this light blue lines, that is actually the top here in November. This data goes up to November 2020. The US is actually trading at volumes greater than what they were prior to COVID. So that's really interesting. So who's winning and losing in that little scenario? We have Taiwan and Qatar, like I said before, significant increase in their cargo volumes on those sectors, and the US. And it'll be really interesting to watch how the two Taiwan-based airlines and Qatar take that opportunity forwards from here, particularly as some of the larger airlines like Cathay Pacific and Emirates and the like put more capacity back into the market. Really interesting growth in cargo volumes as well around a bunch of different Pacific Islands type destinations. That's largely related to, I think, the Australia's role in supporting those countries and as a logistics and services hub for some of those smaller nations. And then there's Guam as well, and I haven't quite got to the bottom of the Guam thing, but I suspect it's either a DHL freighter or perhaps some military traffic. But prior to COVID, there was no traffic coming through Guam, and now there is. So they've got actually quite a serious volume coming from Guam into Australia now. So those are the people who are performing better than November 2019. So this is comparing November 2020 result with the November 2019 result. However, countries that are really struggling are Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia. These are countries where we understand they're still severely impacted by COVID. So there's still a long way to go for recovery in these markets. Some of our really significant trading partners, though, are still depressed in terms of the cargo volumes going between Australia and their centres, like Singapore, the UAE, Korea and China in particular. Okay, so pain and gain. I did have this titled winners and losers, but I didn't want to offend anyone, so I changed it to pain and gain, because it is definitely a bit of pain and gain out there in the market at the moment. And what we can see too, Australian airports are experiencing growth in their business. When we look year to date, November to November, Toowoomba Wellcamp Airport, of course, having a very small volume, 182% looks like massive growth, but it is actually a fairly small volume. So while it's great year-on-year growth, it doesn't reflect a very large proportion of the overall market. But they're certainly making hay while the sun shines, for them anyway. And Sydney Airport is seeing a 2% increase in cargo volumes. Now, Sydney handle an enormous volume of cargo through that airport, and that 2% will be actually quite a considerable number of kilos of cargo. Airports that are really feeling the pain, however, are what you might call our secondary. If we consider Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane as our three biggest airports, these airports feeling the most pain are probably that second tier below them. They did have international services, but those international services have still not recommenced, at least not recommenced in any real form since COVID started. So Darwin, the Gold Coast, Canberra and Adelaide still really suffering a reduction in cargo volumes. But one of the things here to point out the difference between these two columns of airports is that the airports on the left have invested in air freight strategy and in focusing on developing a dedicated air cargo part of their business. So they have freighter aircraft operating through those airports, and they have had for some time. So they did have that before COVID even started. Now, that being the case, I suspected Melbourne would have performed better than what we're seeing on this if it wasn't for the fact that it went through such a lengthy lockdown and had such a severe local impact to COVID. And I think that's probably really depressed this airport's opportunities. And as Melbourne and the state of Victoria become less impacted by COVID, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that airport really start to bounce back, because it's a really important cargo operating place with significant cargo premises around the airport. Sydney's growth is likely to be driven by cargoes that it's picked up from some of these other airports who have lost their international services. So Sydney is really winning there. So in terms of what that looks like from an actual gross weight point of view, Sydney way in front of everyone else, slightly more cargo than they had in November in the previous year. And Melbourne still suffering quite a bit. And then we have Brisbane and Perth just plateaued out, waiting for better recovery in their passenger services. And I've zoomed down into the smaller airports so you can actually see what's happening there amongst those smaller airports as well. I think it's interesting, you see Adelaide had a complete cessation of cargo, complete cessation of international flights, and no cargo at all between March and then they started again in May, and is actually making quite a healthy growth trajectory and a recovery trajectory from May. So that looks really good. Then the brown line below Adelaide is Toowoomba Wellcamp Airport. And if you look over on the far left, you can see that they are basically invisible amongst those few smallest airports. And now they're just climbing their way above there a little bit. So that's good luck to them with what they're trying to achieve there. It's great to see. I wanted to have a think about what is driving some of these recoveries as opposed to the markets that are not recovering. So I compared our top 10 inbound and outbound markets to their rate of recovery and also their whether or not they've received funding under the IFAM program. Now, the International Freight Assistance Mechanism wasn't intended to help airlines to recover their business and their operations. It was more intended to help Australian importers and exporters get their product to market in an air cargo market that was very capacity constrained and becoming very expensive. And I think it's doing that quite effectively, and it really has focused on the largest markets. From an inbound point of view, interesting to see, you know, the USA at 171% of what it was, so large inbound market for us. And that is funded by IFAM. However, some of our other great growth stories here, like Qatar and Taiwan, not funded by IFAM, however, still experiencing significant recovery in their inbound operations into Australia. From the outbound markets point of view, same story. We're seeing some of these are our biggest markets by volume, and some of them are supported by IFAM and some of them are not. The strongest growth and recovery is occurring in Qatar and Taiwan again, and it's really led by those airlines operating out of those centres, their appetite to put on capacity. So there's a lot of capacity in the air cargo, in terms of air cargo capacity available into Qatar and Taiwan at the moment, and that's why we're seeing this recovery. However, IFAM is supporting markets like Singapore and China and Hong Kong, and those markets are large volumetric markets in terms of Australian outbound air cargoes. However, they're very much dominated by low yield cargoes that will really be struggling to pay the current commercial price for air cargo out of Australia to those places. So have a think, you know, what are the recovery factors here? This graph shows you the percentage of, so compared to November 2019 being the base level, or 100% of their capacity, what happened to each of these airlines' capacities through the COVID period up until November 2020. This dark line here, I'm not really sure if everyone can see my mouse or not, but this dark line here is Qatar Airways, and you can see out of all of the airlines, they only dropped capacity to around about 50% of what it was in November 2019, and they've maintained that. And I was actually speaking with some people in Qatar recently, and this has been an organisational aim, has been to support the world in moving through COVID and to help people get where they needed to get and goods get where they needed to get to, so they'd maintain capacity around the world as much as they possibly could. Now that's fantastic that airlines able to finance that, because of course there's a large cash outpouring happening in a situation like that, but they are positioning themselves powerfully in the recovery. You can also see some of these airlines completely stopped operations. So Delta Airlines, for example, this bright blue line here with the pointy part over on the far right-hand side, completely stopped operations and then made a very strong recovery. And you're seeing that in a couple of the US airlines. Here's American Airlines, this brown line here at the very bottom. So what we're understanding is, you know, these recovery factors, recovery is commercially driven by the airline's needs, by the airline's ability and appetite to withstand the cash flow impact of operating despite the fact there's no passengers to really fly on their planes. And also, though, the relative progress of a nation through the whole COVID experience, and that's why we're seeing some countries like, you know, the Philippines and Malaysia and Indonesia sitting back a little bit in terms of their recovery, whereas countries like, you know, China more advanced in terms of their recovery. I think it is really interesting when you look at the US data, though, and it's almost like the US just ignored COVID happened. You don't see this sharp fall in the overall cargo volumes to the US that you do see in the other markets. So generally, I think IFAM, well, no direct correlation exists between the IFAM funding and the recovery of these particular markets or their airlines. That was not the intention of IFAM, and I think it is doing a really important job of supporting exporting and importing businesses in alleviating some of the cost of using these air cargo routes at the moment. But air cargo recovery is going to be commercially driven, and that's a great thing because we can rely upon that. Sooner or later, governments have got to stop spending money. So I think it's still a very valuable and important program. So let's have a bit of a look at what are the categories of air exports and how that might have changed when you compare 2019 to 2020. And this is on gross weight rather than value. most of these, and this is typical, this is all of Australia together, this is typical of Australian air exports, most of these are fairly high volume and relatively, in terms of air cargo products, relatively low value products, with the exception of things like medical products and special transactions, which is all sorts of weird stuff not counted in the trade figures. So I wish I could tell you what heterocyclic compounds are. I think that's maybe an oversimplification of one of the harmonized system classification codes that we use to classify cargo. I know that it's some sort of organic chemical. Apart from that, I'm sorry, I might have to go and Google that and find out what it is, but I saw that pop up there and I was a bit surprised by it. But so these are our top 10, and while there has been, the dark blue is 2020, the light blue is 2019, and there has been a reduction there, but there hasn't been a massive reshuffling of these things. The top 10 from 2019 are still the top 10 for 2020. So it's just a bit of a reshuffling, it's just a bit of a reduction in value rather than a total reshuffle of what our exports look like by air. So there's very few low value air exports, and this is caused by both the reduction in capacity and the higher air freight rates. And some lower value air freight exports are seeking to either move to sea freight, which most definitely has its own issues at the moment, or move into domestic markets, which we're seeing with a lot of our primary product at the moment. Just interesting note is that these top 10 categories, they represent 75% of the gross weight of air cargoes that went out of Australia. However, they represent just 15% of the total value of all air freights that went out of Australia. And it'll come back to something about the diverse types of business you need for an air cargo business case, and we'll talk about that later. The 7 categories, which represent 75% of the value of air freight exports, only represent 8% of the gross weight. So what we have is very much like the passenger business. You have a large volume of low yield customers and a very small number of very high yield customers who are really important to the business. So let's have a look at imports. Very similar story, except there isn't the same reduction. And we know that already from the data I showed you earlier. So we've got very similar quantities for most of these categories as was in the previous calendar year. The top 10 is still the top 10. Again, no massive juggling around with who's who and who's most important to us in Australia. However, notice that these are much more manufactured goods in this category. And it goes to the fact that air imports overall are worth more than air exports, certainly per kilo and as a set as well. That speaks to their importance in the airline business case as well. So overall, there has been a shift towards higher cargo values or high value cargoes. The dark line at the top shows you the average value per kilo of imports, air imports into Australia, and then the lighter line is for exports. And you can see both have moved up, and both have moved up to the same degree as well. Okay, so what's happening in terms of the future of air cargo? There's an enormous amount of change happening. I think we would all agree that your recovery doesn't look like 2019. It might look like 2019 in terms of quantum, but it probably doesn't look like 2019 structurally for the industry. I turned to Boeing's World Air Cargo Forecast. This is available on the Boeing's website if you'd like to take a look at it. It's probably one of the most up-to-date pieces of work you can find on the future of air cargo. However, Boeing are clearly trying to sell some planes as well. So bear that in mind when you give it a read, but it's a pretty good report. Some of their key points are that freighters continue to carry over half of all air cargo traffic. Now, in Australia, like I said earlier, freighters traditionally carry around about 20% of air cargo traffic. So will this change? It may change. We'll have to wait and see. There are quite a few reasons why freighters are really important to the world air cargo industry, and Boeing has made a little list of them there for you. However, I think one of the other things to bear in mind there is that this whole situation has demonstrated how vulnerable the aviation industry is by throwing all of its eggs into the passenger basket. And if air cargo represents an opportunity to diversify both an airline and an airport business and have a business sector that is not so significantly impacted by the cessation of travel as what the passenger business is. So I think from both the airport, from a strategic point of view for your airport, and from an airline point of view, while freighter aircraft meet a specific market need, as explained by Boeing here, they also represent an important strategic opportunity for airports and for airlines. So next point is that the global freighter fleet is expected to grow more than 60% over the next 2 decades. I got all excited when I read that because I'm pretty passionate about cargo. I think it's super interesting and really important. So I looked up how much is the passenger fleet forecast to grow by, and I was kind of imagining that maybe the passenger fleet was only going to grow a little bit and the cargo fleet was going to grow heaps. Anyway, I found that the passenger fleet is forecast to grow by 88% over the same period, which took a little bit of the wind out of my sails. However, 3/4 of that is narrow body aircraft, and narrow body aircraft do not meet the needs of air cargo shippers in the same way that wide body aircraft does, and that's because of the ability to palletize cargo into unit load devices. The unit load devices are important for the security of cargo, and they also provide a better quality cool chain solution for perishable cargoes. So I think that, you know, what's clear from Boeing's report is that the future airline needs fleet flexibility and is turning to a greater degree to narrow body aircraft for that. And this is going to increase the importance of freighter aircraft as certain sectors or certain parts of the global network might be given over to narrow body as opposed to wide body. The cargoes that would have been carried on those wide body aircraft still need to get somewhere somehow. So, and I think these are the sorts of reasons that are going to drive a long-term change in the relationship between cargoes and passengers as revenue. So considerations for your air cargo business case. And I just want to make a mention of this photographer. I love putting beautiful photos in things, and I've put his website there, jpcvanheist.com. Stunning photos if you're looking for some nice photos of some airplanes to put in a presentation. Some of the best I've seen, so full credit to him for that photo. So first consideration I want to have a bit of a chat about is what we'd call the air cargo value chain. Part of the air cargo value chain is your airport's capabilities, your physical infrastructure and its capability to support the type of aircraft that might want to land and take off with cargoes on them. However, no matter how big your runway or how strong your pavement, if you don't have an air cargo value chain around the airport, there is no way of getting cargoes onto the aircraft. So when considering an air cargo strategy or an air cargo business case, it is important to give some thought to whether these parts actually exist and are they functional, do they meet the needs of the airline at the end of the chain from an export point of view anyway. You need to have exporters if you're looking at international cargo. Clearly you need to have exporters. Now, an important point is that primary producers are very rarely exporters. Primary producers often grow primary product and then they sell it to someone else who's an exporter. So you need to have exporters, not just primary producers. You need to have freight forwarders. Freight forwarders are enormously important stakeholders in the air cargo value chain, and they make most of the buying decisions in terms of how product gets to market. You'll need a cargo terminal. Cargo terminal actually works for the airline to prepare cargo for transport. And you'll need a ground handler who actually loads the plane. And of course, you'll need an airline. So all of these pieces are going to be really important. And it's important to think broadly around the entire value chain, not just the airline itself. Then we also want to give some thought to cargo mix. As you can see from the data I've shown you before, there is a mix in lower yield and high volume cargoes. So things like fruits and vegetables are high volume but fairly low yield. And that's great economy-like or sail class, I guess, type cargoes. But to make the business case really sing, you're also going to need some high yield cargoes. And a lot of the time, there are imported cargoes that are not included in trade statistics. So if you look to DFAT for data to support a air cargo business case, a lot of the time it won't include some of the cargoes, because there's a lot of cargoes which travel which do not impact Australia's balance of trade and therefore are excluded from the trade statistics. So understanding what they are and how to bring them back into the business case is really important. Otherwise, you could be underrepresenting the opportunity for an airline by even 30%. So take a look at the pictures. You see the horses and the jet engine, which is on the lower right side. Both of those represent really high yield opportunity for an airline. However, they're probably excluded from the international trade data. So it is important to access a data source that can make sure you get the full picture. So top left-hand picture is some of that lower yield product. That's your fruit and veg. On the right of that, though, you see this is the shipment of vaccine that came in on Singapore Airlines just the other day under DHL's management. Now, pharmaceuticals are a really important and high yield part of the industry. Then the picture below is a jet engine. This is a cargo-only aircraft type cargo because it'll be simply too big to fit on the lower deck. So that's the sort of thing that goes on freighters. And same with horses. They also don't much like it on the lower deck. They tend to find it a little bit cramped down there, so they tend to go on the main deck of a freighter. So cargo mix is really important. And then the other thing that's really important is cargo network. When you're looking at where cargoes need to go, it's important to find a solution where both the airline solution maximizes the options and the problems it can solve for your local exporting and importing community, but also the airline that is best able to realize the revenue opportunities that are inherent in your local cargo communities. Now, we all love to think of Qantas sitting on the apron there and a Qantas jet going from Australia to another global destination. However, cargoes don't code share like the passenger business does. It's somewhat awkward and cost prohibitive. It just doesn't seem to work very well. So typically for Australia, unless you're talking about a really big centre with a large volume of cargo on a unique city pair, you probably need a strong network. This is Qatar's network out of Doha. And then you need to have a bit of a think about some of these demand, these demand factors. Things like directionality, imports versus exports, seasonality. Do you have cargoes all year round, or is there like a real heap of them in a couple of months and then there's none a few months later? Do you have any large shippers that might be prepared to make a long-term commitment to an airline? What's leaking from your community and using another airport? And what are the cargo types and their volumes? It's important to consider the price sensitivity of the shippers and the cost efficacy of existing transport options and the potential value add. Does it improve the value of a shipper's cargo using air transport, or does it save them money? Is it more expensive, but the value improvement is greater than the additional expense? So these are some of the things you need to look at. So to round that out, some takeaways for you. This is the greatest turbulence in our industry's history. And in this turbulence, cargo is performing. And there's every reason to think cargo will continue to perform and provides a real opportunity to build resilient businesses for both airports and airlines and robust global supply chains, which is, of course, what the air cargo industry is all about. Generally speaking, airports have not maximised or optimised the air freight revenue opportunity, and they often also lack strategy around air freight development, and they do not understand the commercial drivers from an airport, from an airline's point of view. It's important to learn a little bit about it and make sure you build a solid strategy for how your airport can both optimise the revenue that could be discovered inside air cargo, and also build a business around air cargo, be that an international or a domestic business. And the air cargo opportunity could be, it can be really broad. It can be freighter aircraft, like big freighter aircraft like the 747-8, or it could be services by the toll freighter network, a smaller freighter network that does an express service domestically and connects well to an international network as well. Or perhaps cargo is a powerful part of your passenger business case. Whatever it is, there is a strategy there that needs to be unlocked and leveraged to best support the airport's recovery after COVID. Also, some real thought needs to be given to both the operational, regulatory, network, product and business case aspects of air cargo development. They do differ from the passenger business somewhat. So it's important to make sure you get the right advice and insights into what's important there. Overall, I feel that air cargo represents perhaps the greatest unrealised commercial opportunity for airports globally. Very cognizant that airports landing fees for cargo aircrafts are nowhere near as attractive as they are for passenger aircraft. However, the infrastructure and capital investment required from the airport is also neither as onerous. I'm also realised that if we suddenly decide we're going to ask airlines for more money in order to land their aircraft, they are going to resist. However, I do feel that there's an opportunity to better align the interests of airports and air cargo operators to provide a better future for both. So that's the end, and I welcome any questions. And this is another photo from this wonderful photographer, JPC Van Heist. Over to you, Scott.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Sarah. Greatly appreciate that extremely wide-ranging and very useful presentation regarding air freight. So look, we have some questions from the floor. So the first interesting one is, could air cargo heading outbound lagging inbound air cargo in 2020 be due to China putting tariffs on Australian export products? So
yeah, good question. Look, I'm sure that'll be a part of it. However, we have significant cargo volumes going to a lot of other markets aside from China. So yes, certainly that would be contributing. However, our exports to markets like Singapore and Thailand and Hong Kong are also quite depressed.
Okay, good. So it seems to be a bit of a overall issue in the market rather than purely being caught up in the trade wars.
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Yeah, it's one of a number of factors, I think, that one.
Okay, that's good. It's good to know it's not the exclusive factor. Look, the second one is, what is the situation with the domestic air freight business in Australia?
Domestic, yeah, sure.
Yeah, what's happening locally? So
Yeah, okay. So the domestic market looks a little bit different, and that's because we're seeing some recovery in the passenger operations for the domestic market. So total, tons on board for domestic in November 2019 was around about 16,000 tons, and in November 20 it was more like 14,000 tons. So there is a reduction there, but it's not terrible. What is really interesting though is that freight, as a part of total ton kilometres, the freight portion of total ton kilometres has increased from like 3.8% domestically in November 2019 to 13.7%. And we have more domestic flights overall for freight as well. So it's quite interesting that it's still depressed, but it is a bigger portion of their business also than what it used to be.
Okay. Yes. So do you think there's, obviously, as you were saying in your presentation, Toll is a domestic air freight operator that obviously runs its own fleet of aircraft as part of its integrated third-party logistics network. But do you see opportunities for other entrants into purely air cargo flights rather? Qantas have a handful of domestic freighters, and I think Virgin might as well. But yeah, is there an opportunity, do you think, for another entrant?
Yeah, look, I think there's an opportunity for Qantas and Virgin, given their other network capabilities. Cargo's often not just a point-to-point solution, so it needs to, like, perhaps a cargo might need to go from Mackay to Manila. So they'll need a domestic carrier to go from Mackay to Brisbane, and then an international carrier to go from, Brisbane to Manila. So that's why I think, there are opportunities, but they're limited to organisations that can offer that overall network capability. I know that Qatar has a strong relationship with Qantas as well, and so there's good opportunity for Qantas to leverage the Qatar global network and provide that domestic leg. If airlines can improve upon their ability to essentially code-share for cargo, which they don't quite do, they do something called interline. It's not really the same, and it's kind of expensive and clunky. But if that could be improved upon, then there could be a lot of opportunities for other parties. It just comes back to the network capability.
Okay, thank you for that. And that kind of leads into my next question around outside the major airports, particularly the big three and Perth, if you count the big four that you mentioned earlier, so Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth. What do you think are the other air cargo opportunities for Australian airports, particularly those regional airports and the ones that find themselves located in a high value, say an agribusiness export area, that are wanting to build their air freight capability, but for various reasons that you've outlined may not be fully integrated into that air freight value chain?
Yeah, look, I think that there are opportunities around Australia, however, that they're limited, and the cost of providing the infrastructure for a wide body freighter is significant. Usually, like you take the case of an airport like, say, Sydney or Melbourne Airport, they have the infrastructure to support a 747-8 aircraft. However, the cost of providing that infrastructure is amortized over numerous flights, only a small portion of which are cargo flights. So if a regional airport, though, builds a runway that has that capability and it doesn't have any 747 type or large Code E passenger aircraft, it has to amortize the cost of that infrastructure over the limited number of freighter flights, and that becomes quite difficult. So I think there is some reality checking needed around what are the local cargoes, and what are they worth, and what is the price sensitivity of their shippers, and how can they be complemented by some higher value cargoes. We do see some exceptions in the market, like the Wellcamp situation. It's often held up like, well, they're exporting primary produce and they're making a go of it. However, Wellcamp's also providing a wide body freighter service that supports Brisbane, because Brisbane Airport doesn't actually have any wide body freighter services at the moment. So Wellcamp Airport is drawing all of the wide body types, high value, oversized cargoes that come from the Gold Coast and Brisbane. So it's essentially serving the capital city. So I think there are opportunities. There's some really interesting things evolving in the oil and gas sector. There's some interesting military and military contractor cargoes, and aviation industry type cargoes. And if you compare that type of stuff, that really expensive stuff, with the ag opportunity, then you might find something that's really going to fly, if you pardon the pun.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for that, Sarah. If there's no other questions from the guests who are listening in today, I think we might wrap it up there, I would say. So, but thank you again, Sarah, for a really great webinar. There was a lot to learn from that, and I think in terms of reflections on this, it's kind of, I think for me, the big takeaways were, for an airport wanting to be part of air freight, you need to look for the right carrier that has a network with a sufficient span, either domestically or internationally, to get the full end-to-end journey from origin to destination. There's plenty of opportunities for airports in air freight, but airports need to understand both the air freight sector and the whole value chain in the end-to-end movement across the sector, rather than just putting up business cases to build it and they will come. I think that was a really important part of that as well. And that indeed there are opportunities, but you really have to do your groundwork as an airport before you put up a major development proposal to do something with air freight. You need to really understand the market, and I think from the sounds of it, many airports are just at the beginning of their journey of understanding air freight. And hopefully today, airports members who are listening in will have developed a greater understanding of air freight from what you've given us, Sarah. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So to wrap up the webinar, just a final reminder that today's webinar has been recorded. It'll be available on the AAA website and emailed to all participants once available. I encourage everyone today to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered in the webinar series. So please email events@airports.asn.au. A quick reminder about our pavements and lighting forum that's on in May. Partnership and exhibition booths are selling quickly. Please email events@airports.asn.au to showcase your products and services at pavements and lighting. Registration and program details will be available shortly. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Sarah, for a really great presentation today. I got a lot out of it and I hope everyone else did too. So thank you very much. Enjoy the remainder of your day and the remainder of your week. Stay safe, everyone, and look forward to seeing you online again soon. Thank you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.